In 1852, a Canadian inventor named Abraham Gessner discovered how to make kerosene from crude petroleum. In an age when candles and whale oil provided the only light after sundown, it was a dramatic discovery. Borrowing a page from alcohol distillers, Gessner used a primitive still-type system to distill and refine crude petroleum by heating it and separating its various elements. One of those elements was kerosene, which he found burned longer and cleaner than whale oil.
The superiority of kerosene was not only in the fact that it was a better illuminant, but it was ever so much cheaper. Whale oil was getting extremely costly. Town gas, for example, about 1860, you could light your house with town gas for about $10 a month. You could light your house with kerosene for $10 a year.
Created over millions of years by heat and pressure, petroleum is formed when living things die and decay and are converted to carbon-based minerals. The Bible records that Noah applied petroleum to the ark as a waterproofer. 1,000 years before Christ, the Chinese were burning it in lamps. And by 1100 AD, Christian crusaders found they could set petroleum ablaze to make Greek fire, which they hurled at their enemies in battle. Early Americans gathered the black goo from pools where it had oozed to the surface. By that time, the principal use of petroleum was as a medicine.
Petroleum was thought to be good for rheumatism or for arthritis or as an eye salve, various kinds of medicinal uses.
As long as petroleum was limited to use as an ointment or toothache remedy, there was little reason for men to spend much time searching for it. A few hundred gallons skimmed off pools each year more than met the demand. But the discovery of kerosene changed all that. Within a year of Gessner's discovery, his kerosene works was producing 5,000 gallons a day, and the need for more crude petroleum became critical. By 1859, 34 startup companies were producing $5 million worth of kerosene annually. The rush to find oil, and with it, huge fortunes, was on. Among the fortune hunters was a man named George Bissell. Bissell heard that salt miners in western Pennsylvania were complaining that their digs were being contaminated by oil. Hearing the news, he hired Edwin L. Drake to investigate and determine if the region held any potential for profit.
Edwin L. Drake, I think, is one of the most fantastic figures in American industrial history. He was a railroad conductor, a hotel clerk, an agricultural worker. Here is a man who had no technical background at all.
Drake sought drilling help from some of the people in the area who were experienced salt well drillers. He found William Smith, known to everyone as Uncle Billy, and hired him at the royal sum of $2.50 a day to come to Titusville and help him drill this well.
Smith went to work in a pump house that Drake had bought months before. He began by building a kind of battering ram out of white oak, which was used to pound metal pipe into the ground. The crude method worked for a while, but the human-powered contraption was useless when they hit bedrock 39 feet down. Drake hooked a steam engine to the ram and continued to pound into the earth. For months they drilled in vain. Then, on August 29, 1859, with the project on the verge of cancellation, Drake came to check on Smith. He found the blacksmith and his sons not drilling, but standing guard at the site. Around them were tubs and barrels filled with oil. Drake had made the most important oil strike in history.
He had persistence, he had imagination, he didn't know what couldn't be done. So finally, after he got down to about 69 feet, He realized that there was something down there that you could see that was not water, it was not brine, and when it was pumped up, it was petroleum. And so that was the crucial breakthrough.
News of the find quickly spread. Thousands were drawn to the area to make their fortune at a time when oil was selling for $20 a barrel. Almost overnight, a new town sprung up at an oil field near Drake's Well. Appropriately named Pithole City, by September of 1865, the town had 15,000 residents.
By the midsummer of 1865, by July, Pithole had its post office opened up, and by September of 1865, it had its own newspaper. Pithole had over 50 hotels, and the boarding houses, there's too numerous to count. It was impossible to keep track of all the people, but the post office would handle 10,000 letters a day, and a good many of those went to the dead letter office due to the fact that so many people were in and out of Pithole compared with your other smaller towns around the area. Pithole was where all the excitement was at that period of time of 1865.
Then, in January of 1866, the wells began to dry up. Output fell from 6,000 barrels a day to 3,000. Within the year, Pithole was producing only 2,000 barrels a day, and by the following fall, the flow had become a mere drip. Fortunes that had been made overnight vanished just as quickly. Within a year, the town was deserted. A parcel of land that had sold for $2 million in 1865 was auctioned off for $4.37. Edwin Drake, the man responsible for the most important oil strike in history, died penniless in 1880. Still, America was hooked on petroleum and the kerosene lamp. Great wealth awaited any man who could extract, process, and refine oil cheaply and quickly. Just such a man was working as a clerk at a Cleveland produce shipping firm. His name, John Davidson Rockefeller. John Davidson Rockefeller got into the oil business almost as an afterthought. At the age of 19, he and a partner had formed a produce shipping firm in Cleveland, Ohio, specializing in pork, salt, and wheat. During the early years of the Civil War, Rockefeller's produce firm prospered as wartime demands for these staples increased. Already a wealthy man by his late 20s, Rockefeller saw the future one cold fall day in 1863 when a new railroad reached Cleveland. Now Cleveland was linked to the oil-rich regions of Pennsylvania. Dozens of petroleum refineries quickly sprang up along the city's rail lines. Rockefeller knew an opportunity when he saw one. In 1864, he bought his first oil refinery. It did not take him long to realize that the profit potential dwarfed that of the produce business. He became convinced that his future lay in oil, not commodity exchange.
Rockefeller's entry into oil refining follows, I think, a careful analysis of the commodity by Rockefeller himself. He saw the potential in this. Its lighting capability was much higher than candles or camphene or sperm oil, and he probably saw the potential. But he also heard what I would call the ruckus coming from the Pennsylvania border, because by the mid-1860s, Cleveland's newspapers were awash with stories of the fortunes being made and lost in the oil fields near Titusville and in western Pennsylvania.
Rockefeller's partner, Maurice Clark, did not share his enthusiasm for the oil industry. The partners reluctantly decided to part ways. The two agreed to bid against each other for the firm's assets, including the refinery. The stakes were high for both men, but Rockefeller's resolve was unwavering.
That was the day that determined my career. I felt the bigness of it, but I was as calm as I am talking to you now. John Rockefeller.
In the end, Clark bid $72,000. Rockefeller bid $72,500. It was a $500 difference that altered the course of history. Immediately upon taking control of the company, Rockefeller focused his energies exclusively on oil. As the Civil War ended and America's economy became more and more industrialized, demand for kerosene grew in the nation's rapidly expanding urban areas. Rockefeller's profits soared. In 1866 alone, sales of Rockefeller kerosene reached $2 million. Despite his success, Rockefeller was not content, but his drive to expand his operations was at the mercy of his suppliers, over which he had virtually no control.
John D. Rockefeller was concerned about the fluctuating prices in the oil industry. It was a boom-bust industry, and he thought that if he could stabilize the industry, this would not only be good for America, but it would be good for John D. Rockefeller.
To Rockefeller, stabilize meant control, and the best way to get control was to buy it. He bought his own ships to transport Rockefeller kerosene from Cleveland to the Midwest, tanker cars to transport crude oil to the company's refineries and warehouses in New York. He even purchased forest reserves of white oak timber to ensure the company had an adequate supply of barrels. But there was one more thing left to conquer, and for help, Rockefeller turned to a man who was to become his closest business associate and friend, Henry Flagler.
Flagler joined Rockefeller in 1867. He had a kind of an interesting background as well. He had been selling produce and mostly distilling whiskey. And he made quite a bit of money, but unfortunately he also lost all of the money. One of these gentlemen up and down several times until he joined Rockefeller in 1867. He was sort of the perfect counterpart to Rockefeller. He was energetic and outgoing, sort of an extrovert to offset Rockefeller's very introverted kind of personality. And the two of them made an ideal team.
Together, Rockefeller and Flagler were determined to protect the oil industry and themselves from the chaos of economic uncertainty. But to do so, they would have to wrestle control away from the most powerful industrial force in America. In 1870s America, the railroads were all powerful. The growth of American industry was dependent on the rapid transportation of goods and supplies. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was no exception. But while other industries cowered before the powerful railroad companies, Henry Flagler called their bluff. As Secretary of Standard Oil, Flagler was assigned to negotiate shipping rates with the railroads. He went after his task with a ruthlessness and aggressiveness the likes of which the railroads had never seen. Flagler was in an excellent position to negotiate since Standard Oil had a stranglehold on the oil industry. By 1871, Standard Oil transported by rail over 1 million barrels of crude oil and kerosene. The threat of losing Standard shipping business was more than the railroads wanted to risk.
Flagler could dictate the price. If he wanted a rebate from the railroad so that he would have a competitive advantage, all he had to do was tell them that he was not going to pay their price. He was going to pay only something less. If they didn't like that, they could go to some other refiner. The problem was there weren't any other refiners.
Their relationship with the railroads gave Standard Oil an incredible competitive advantage in the petroleum market. Rockefeller's competitors were faced with a stark choice: sell out to Standard Oil or go bankrupt.
There was a pressure brought upon my mind and upon almost all citizens of Cleveland engaged in the oil business that we were virtually killed as refiners. If we did not sell out, we should be crushed. John Alexander, President, Schofield and Company.
To Rockefeller, it didn't matter how his competitors or even the public viewed Standard's business practices. When one rival complained to the oil tycoon that he did not wish to sell, Rockefeller replied bluntly,
You can compete with Standard. We have all the large refineries now. If you refuse to sell, it will end in your being crushed.
By April 1872, Standard Oil had acquired or absorbed 21 other refining firms in the Cleveland area alone. Rockefeller himself, only a decade after entering the oil business, was one of the richest men in the country, with a personal wealth of several $1 million. He was now both admired and feared by businessmen throughout America.
It's interesting to try to figure out how much money he made and how much he accumulated. I think the answer is that at the time, not even Rockefeller knew, because the money was literally coming in faster than he could count it.
I think comparing a Rockefeller to a Bill Gates is probably a good example, because Gates' personal wealth now is in excess of $10 or $15 billion, and that's so far beyond what an average American worker makes today. I think very much an average American worker of the 1890s or the turn of the century probably would have seen Rockefeller in the same terms, because his wealth was certainly in the hundreds of millions, perhaps even approaching $1 billion. So way, way ahead. An average American production worker, a factory worker at the turn of the century, might be making, depending on his skill level or her skill level, might be making $5, $10, $12 a week. So $500 or $600 a year was considered a decent living for an average industrial worker in America, comparing that with a fortune worth hundreds of millions. So the gap is similar, and I think Americans saw these so-called robber barons as people, in effect, living in a whole other world. I mean, their whole standard of living was just, it couldn't even be compared in some ways. The gap was so great.
The future growth of Standard Oil seemed limitless. But forces were gathering that would soon threaten the mighty empire and its king. By 1879, after 15 long years of intimidation, force, and strong-arm tactics, the Standard Oil Company controlled an incredible 90% of all refinery operations in the United States. But Rockefeller's overwhelming power caused some Americans to fear that the free enterprise system was in danger. Without competition, there was no force that could check what Standard could do to prices if it so chose.
It's looked upon as the monopoly, the evil trust, and it's looked upon at this point in what it begins to be known as the American Progressive Era as the antithesis of what America should be.
Criticism of Rockefeller reached unprecedented levels. His enemies proclaimed that Standard Oil was legally chartered only in Ohio, and that under the laws of the time, the company had no right to own refineries or warehouses in other states. Moving quickly to protect himself, Rockefeller came up with a brilliant plan. In 1882, he organized the Standard Oil Trust.
The trust is a legal form of business organization, and in the latter part of the 19th century, it was the mechanism by which monopolies were created. What Rockefeller did with all of his oil companies, he, in a sense, folded them into the Standard Trust that ended up owning all of the shares of these companies. Rockefeller could control all of these and operate as a monopoly.
With his refining and distribution interests protected by the trust, Rockefeller set his sights on production. A golden opportunity soon presented itself. In the late 1880s, the Pennsylvania oil fields began to dry up. The center of the nation's oil production shifted west to newly discovered sources in Ohio and Indiana. The trust began buying up all the petroleum-rich properties it could get its hands on. By 1891, despite the fact that it had owned virtually no oil fields just a decade before, Standard now produced over 25% of the nation's total output of crude and refined nearly 90%. The nation was totally dependent on kerosene for light, and Standard controlled virtually every drop. It was simple supply and demand, and Rockefeller, for all intents and purposes, was the only supplier. Standard Oil seemed unstoppable. But on November 1st, 1879, the U.S. Patent Office awarded patent number 223898 to Thomas Edison. It was for the electric lamp. Edison found that his lighting system would be so cheap that only the wealthy could afford to burn candles. But of course, it was not the candle makers who had the most reason to be concerned. The light bulb took the country by storm and put the entire oil industry at risk.
Thomas Edison was just not an inventor, a scientist. He realized very quickly the commercial interest his invention would create. He priced his electricity to be competitive with oil. By 1892, an oil man, if he could sell a gallon of oil for 2 cents, he was considered pretty lucky.
As the 19th century came to a close, oil men feared for their future. But another invention soon appeared that filled them not with dread, but with hope. Henry Ford's automobile ran on an internal combustion engine powered by gasoline, a derivative of petroleum.
About the same time frame that most American homes were beginning to be electrified, the horseless carriage came along, the development of the internal combustion engine, and then the mass marketing of those so that every home could have an automobile, and they were all powered by gasoline. So one door opens when one door closes.
The automobile had saved Rockefeller's industry from oblivion. But another threat to the Rockefeller empire was emerging as the 20th century began. A new oil-producing region of the country being developed by a rough and tumble breed of men far removed from the Eastern establishment of John Rockefeller and Standard Oil. They were called wildcatters. As the 20th century began, the automobile was transforming the oil industry. Gasoline-powered vehicles promised to more than make up for the declining use of petroleum and kerosene production. Between 1900 and 1910, almost 500,000 cars took to America's roads. It was clear that new sources of petroleum would have to be found. Men began looking for the black gold in the most unlikely areas. One of these areas was Texas. The first gusher of Texas crude exploded from the ground on January 10, 1901. It was the largest strike in history, and it was a culmination of 2 years of struggle by a new breed of oilmen called wildcatters. It also marked the beginning of the end for Standard Oil's domination of the oil industry. The company now had to compete with thousands of oilmen, probing and drilling the earth in search of oil. The stereotypical wildcatter was a man with little education who had a singular desire to strike it rich in oil. One such man was a one-armed merchant and Sunday school teacher named Petillo Higgins. Higgins was convinced that oil could be found at a site near Beaumont, Texas. On a small hill called Spindletop, flammable gas bubbled out of springs. Higgins felt that the gas was a sure indication of oil. However, practically everyone associated with the oil industry knew that oil fields were chiefly an eastern phenomenon. Expert geologists proclaimed the notion of oil in Beaumont ridiculous. Townspeople began to think that Higgins might be insane. All the experts agreed that Texas would never develop as a major oil-producing region.
In the late 19th century, the oil industry in the United States was primarily concentrated in a belt of states that surround the Great Lakes. Pennsylvania was, of course, where oil was first discovered in America. By the turn of the century, Ohio is the largest oil-producing state. The state of Texas, by comparison, is a relatively minor player.
In a desperate attempt to prove his theory, Higgins took out an ad for a professional driller. Only one, Anthony F. Lucas, a salt and sulfur driller by trade, responded. After listening to the Higgins story and examining the site for himself, Lucas became convinced that Higgins was not as crazy as people thought. Lucas and Higgins appealed to Standard Oil for help, but were summarily rejected. Desperate for funds, they then turned to the Pittsburgh-based wildcat firm of James Guffey and John Galley. The firm was financed by the Mellon family, who were among the nation's leading bankers.
Higgins had no money. He'd become a bit of a joke in Beaumont. Nobody was willing to put any money into anything that he put together any longer. Lucas started looking for more money, and a deal was worked out. Guffey and Galley would find the money. As it turns out, they went to the Mellon banking house, and the Mellon brothers gave a small percentage to Lucas, and they said nothing for Higgins. If Lucas wanted to share with Higgins, he could, out of the generosity of his heart, but they weren't willing to make a deal that would include Petillo Higgins.
Pushing Higgins aside, Lucas started drilling in the fall of 1900. After drilling down almost 900 feet, a trickle of oil bubbled to the surface. One of the experienced drillers on the crew speculated that the well might eventually produce 50 barrels a day. Most of the other drillers felt that this estimate was overly optimistic. Drilling continued into January. Each day, new pipe was added as the drill bored deeper and deeper into the Texas earth. On the 10th day of the new year, Spindletop began to shake. Then it erupted.
Spindletop is like no other oil find anywhere. It doubles the total U.S. production of oil by itself. It alone represents 1/5 of the oil supply of the world at that time. There is a lake of oil before they can shut down the gusher that is a mile long.
Land which had sold for $10 an acre a year before now went for $1 million an acre. Beaumont instantly became a boom town. Almost overnight, the city's population grew from 10,000 to 50,000. An additional 16,000 people crammed into tents on Spindletop itself. An additional 16,000 people crammed into tents on Spindletop itself. Many of those who arrived in Spindletop were from the rougher elements of society.
It was said that half the whiskey consumed in Texas was drunk in Beaumont. Gambling houses were very popular. Gambling was popular, and so was fighting. And usually not a night went by that there weren't 2 or 3 murders. And one morning, the people in Beaumont woke up and 16 bodies were dragged from the river, all with their throats slit.
But it was not only the worst elements of society that came to Beaumont. The prostitutes, swindlers, and thieves who descended on East Texas mingled with some of America's wealthiest families. Members of the Mellon clan made frequent visits to check on their investment at Spindletop. When it became clear that James Guffey lacked skill as a manager, the Mellons got nervous. Recognizing the incredible value of their investment in the Texas wilderness, Andrew Mellon offered to sell the family's interest in Spindletop to Standard Oil. In one of the greatest errors in the company's history, Standard Oil rejected the offer. Andrew Mellon immediately sent his younger brother William to take over management from Guffey. Using the family's vast resources, William resolved to build an oil company that could compete with the colossus known as Standard. With Spindletop producing 3,000 barrels of oil in an hour and oil storage capacity limited, the Mellons' first challenge was getting the oil quickly to market. William then ordered construction of a 450-mile pipeline linking the Mellon oil fields to the family's refinery at Port Arthur on the Gulf Coast. The oil could now be transported to markets around the globe. The company William built was to become known throughout the world as Gulf Oil. But Gulf was not the only new company to emerge from the Spindletop gusher. After hearing about the Spindletop find, a former Standard Oil pipeline supervisor and wildcatter named Joe Culligan came to Beaumont and quickly organized the Texas Fuel Oil Company. By 1905, Culligan had acquired a number of production sites in the Beaumont area and had purchased 4 large oil tankers to transport his petroleum. He renamed his company Texaco.
The size of this Spindletop discovery meant the whole oil industry was going to change. We were already moving in a direction away from the Standard Oil monopoly prior to the discovery of Spindletop, but Spindletop certainly accelerated that. When this field came in, all kinds of new oil companies developed out of it, and the 2 biggest ones that come directly out of Spindletop were Gulf Oil and Texaco.
By 1910, Texas-based oil companies were starting to compete for markets throughout the country. The once invincible Standard Oil began to show cracks. In 1911, those cracks burst. On January 6th, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust was in violation of federal laws which prohibited the restraint of trade. Chief Justice Edward White ruled that Standard Oil would have to be broken up.
The breakup of Standard Oil transformed the oil industry in very short order from essentially a one-company industry, at least in the United States, to one of the most competitive industries around.
Mobil, Chevron, Exxon were all Standard Oil Company breakup. You've got Shell, BP, who are not, Texaco, who are not, but you're looking at the majority of the privately owned oil companies in the world were Standard Oil spin-offs.
The new companies that resulted from Standard's breakup and those that emerged from the Texas oil fields would fiercely compete with each other in the decades to come. Their competition was to transform the very nature of American life. In the decades following the breakup of Standard Oil, America became more dependent than ever on petroleum. Even during the Great Depression, the number of gas-powered cars on the nation's roads continued to grow. And during both world wars, American victory was assured by the nation's domination of world oil supplies. But it was during the decades following World War II that oil consumption reached its apex. As America entered the 1950s, the nation's reliance on oil had grown from a necessity to an addiction. It was an addiction driven by the automobile. America's love affair with the car was consummated. Between 1945 and 1950, the number of vehicles on America's roads climbed from 26 million to 40 million.
At the end of World War II, American life is transformed, and transformed largely by the automobile. The automobile makes it possible for you to live a long way from your job and to commute to work.
Americans are not only buying the house in the suburbs, they're buying a car. In some cases, if they're wealthy enough, they buy two. The other thing that happens is Americans want bigger and bigger cars. The 1950s and 60s are the heyday of what some people call the muscle cars, the V8s, the 400-plus horsepower. And these, of course, are not very fuel efficient. And so our consumption of gasoline and motor oil skyrockets in this period.
For American oil companies, competition was more intense than ever. Dozens of corporate giants battled for the consumer's dollar. In addition to the companies that emerged from Standard's breakup and those that blossomed out of the Spindletop strike, other corporations were making their presence felt in the marketplace. International concerns like British Petroleum were increasingly competitive in the U.S., and Phillips Petroleum had sprung up from the rich oil patch of Oklahoma to become a major player.
Drive with Light View. You knew Light View. For the sweetest rhythm on the road.
With 20 companies all selling essentially the same product at the same price, image and service became the hallmarks of the post-war oil industry.
You can trust your car to the man who wears a star. He's a man best qualified to take care of your car at every Texaco station, clean across the nation. You can trust your car to the man who wears a star. So trust your car to the man who wears a star.
But the good times of the 50s and early 60s would not last forever. Prosperity brought with it its own problems. America's oil fields were proving unable to keep up with demand. By the late 1960s, the nation relied on imported oil to keep the economy strong. Then, in the early 1970s, oil-dependent America's nightmares came true. 13 oil-producing countries in the Middle East and South America formed OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In 1973, OPEC placed an oil embargo on the U.S. and other nations that had supported Israel against the Arab states in the Yom Kippur War. The American economy went into a tailspin as gas shortages gripped the nation. Throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, America was beset by economic problems relating to its reliance on imported oil. Then, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. The American economy went into a tailspin as gas shortages gripped the nation. Throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, America was beset by economic problems relating to its reliance on imported oil. Then, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. Fear spread that Saddam Hussein's armies might push on and seize the Saudi oil fields. To protect the American economy, the nation prepared for war.
Following those meetings, the Saudi government requested our help. And I responded to that request by ordering U.S. air and ground forces to deploy to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Let me be clear, the sovereign independence of Saudi Arabia is of vital interest to the United States.
After an intensive aerial bombardment, Iraq withdrew from Kuwait. Oil prices and America's economy once again stabilized. Today, U.S. companies are using advanced three-dimensional technology to search for oil in ways in which previous generations of oilmen could not have dreamed.
When Rockefeller was pioneering our industry, you know, oil was pretty much close to the surface. I mean, Jed Clampett went out there and he shot his gun in the ground and up came, it was bubbling right there. Didn't have to do much to find it. And what are we seeing now as the future starts to unfold? We don't see lots of people out in the oil field like there were before, but these automated machines where the field is so well automated and so well controlled and so well managed in terms of being safe that we let the machines collect the data, do the work remotely, where we can actually stay in the comfort of our laboratories on what looks like big consoles, like a spaceship, if you will.
It has been almost a century since the collapse of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Colossus. The global dominance enjoyed by American oil companies in the mid-20th century is also gone forever. Still, the nation's oil companies continued the work started by Edwin Drake so long ago, searching the globe for the fuel that powers the nation's industrial empires, the black gold of oil.